everyone. Welcome to this afternoon's session, which I have the privilege of chairing. So this afternoon's session is called Basic Income, Gender and Care. It's such a pertinent topic and such a pertinent set of paper titles that we'll be having the privilege of hearing from our speakers about this afternoon. Before we get underway, I just want to quickly introduce myself. My name's Dr. Zoe Staines. I'm an ARC DECRA Senior Research Fellow here at the University of Queensland and helping out on the LOC here for BN 2022. So really excited to have you all in the room. And I just want to start by first offering my acknowledgement of country. So I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I'm standing on here today, who are the Yagara and Turrbal peoples in Brisbane, and also extend that acknowledgement to any lands that you might be joining us from online as well, and to pay my respects to elders past and present, and to just note that these are unceded lands. I think that's a really important thing to continue to note as we have the privilege of standing on these unceded lands. So once again, thank you very much for joining us for this session this afternoon on basic income, gender and care. Our three speakers this afternoon are three amazing people. First of all, we'll have Eva Cox from the University of Technology, Sydney, speaking to a feminist redefining of the value of our unpaid work contributions via UBI. And then we'll hear from Judith Willis. We have a pre-recorded video from Judith, but Judith will be joining us then for Q&A afterwards. And Judith is from LaTrobe University, and their paper is entitled Basic Income Improves the Lives of All People and Particularly Benefits Women and Children. I couldn't agree more, Judith. And then lastly, we'll be hearing from Annabel Dulhunty from the Australian National University, whose paper is entitled Gender Equality and UBI, or UNI, a review of recent literature. So without further ado, I might pass over to you, Eva. Now, Eva won't be having any slides, but we will hear from Eva just via video. So can I invite you to turn your microphone back on, Eva? And please head off or start us off when you're ready.
I've switched the mic on, so hopefully it's working now. Yes, it was interesting that you actually did. I started there thinking, okay, you know, UBI, I've done a lot of work around this. I suppose I should sort of acknowledge my origins. I've had 50 years of feminist activism in a whole range of areas, and particularly in the social, the relational, and the various other things. And have become very interested in a whole lot of things that actually relate to both society and what we're doing and where we're going and various other things. One of the things that sort of struck me very solidly, and I wanted to bring it up in this situation, is that in a sense, what's been ripping the world apart is what we've been thinking about in terms of what is work for probably the past 20 odd years at least, if not beforehand, because we've actually got to the point where work is seen as a male objective. I mean, we can work hard in the house, but somehow that doesn't count. But work, in inverted commas, is really important. And if you have that, you get paid for it. And a lot of what we do, we don't get paid at all. So when you start thinking about that, it sort of actually brings me into sort of trying to work out how this all came about. I mean, in acknowledging the original people that lived in Australia, they didn't have money. They didn't even count past 5, but they managed to estimate distances. They managed to sort things out. They managed to run societies without pay by exchange and various other things, obviously, as did lots of people. So this whole idea that somehow or other economics, which is my unfavoritist discipline, because whenever you ask anybody to define economics, it'll be very varied because everybody's got different opinions. So I don't believe it really exists, except it manages to persecute us and has made a terrible mess of the world over the last few years. But I think we've got to get back to the idea that we are basically social beings And I wanted to start with, I've got various pieces of paper in front of me, and I didn't manage to organise them stably. But one says the need of a social contract to create voter trust. Now, I want to put up the idea that a universal basic income should be part of a social contract. And working from the feminist viewpoint, I think it should be for those roles, the contract between individuals or citizens. Can we use the term citizens, please? Let's avoid the idea of using the sort of term customer, because I think customer is pretty toxic. All you've got then is choices if you're lucky. Citizenship is something important, yet the government seems to think we're now their customers. And they've even changed the words to do so, and I find that quite offensive. Because citizenship means a sense of belonging, a sense of obligations, both by that which we belong to and our obligations to the fact that we are citizens. And if you think about that, the idea of actually recreating a social contract, which seems to have disappeared ever since neoliberalism decided that markets were much more efficient than governments and started cutting social spending when they took over control, you got the huge split at that particular stage, probably in many ways the most savage split of many of the ones between males and females. Because if you go back into the 19th century, what Western civilization, with a big W and C, had brought in the previous century plus was a combination of the Industrial Revolution and colonization. And this really separated out the business world very solidly from everywhere else. And the business world was mainly men's business. So we ended up with the things of the East India Company, various other things. We ended up with factories. They did let women into them for a while until they let us out to take care of children when they decided children needed to be educated, so they needed us at home. So we've had the ridiculous situation of at least the last century and a half of seeing the sort of concept of masculinity being closely allied with paid jobs. And women fought very hard to get various things, including pay, some pay, equal pay, which we've had now for about 50 years and we still are not getting there, and various other things. But it, in a way, it left men in control of the idea of trade and the workforce. And the workforce was about trading your time for money so you could go and buy the things you needed in the market. When we had the idea of the nation state after World War II, I mean, if you go back before World War II and have a look at the 1930s, and this is a particular bug of mine because I was one of Hitler's refugees at a very early age. But one of the reasons that we had people like Hitler and Mussolini in that period was that they'd set up democracies, but without a welfare state to go with them. So after the war, we had the post-war welfare state. And that was because Roosevelt and Churchill got together and said, if we want to have democracy functioning, it has to have a welfare state attached to it so that there's a clear relationship between those we vote for and the needs we have, which are needs to survive, to live, to be healthy, to be educated, all of those things which don't really fit into markets, not for most of us anyhow. So we ended up coming out of these sorts of the Second World War with a welfare state. But unfortunately, big business then discovered that it was going to cost them more money in taxation. So they got together under the neoliberal banner and started telling everybody we had to have markets instead of government. And the government, including the Labour Party and the Liberal parties and the Americans and the Australians and so on, so started getting rid of the expansion of education, health, and various other things that we'd had post-war as being government responsibilities and put them back to the market. So here we are from the 70s, where the women's movement was very active and we managed to win things. Long time after we won votes, but still we were actually getting somewhere. 1980s, Susan Ryan, an old friend of mine no longer around, moved the the sex discrimination bill and the rights of us to be paid the same amount for work of equal value. And here we are at this stage now with women still being paid less and women being encouraged to go and do the technical stuff, because that way they will raise their incomes, never mind the fact that we underpay nurses, we underpay childcare workers, we underpay all the care type things, because men don't think that's a skill. And unfortunately, a lot of women don't think so, tend not to sort of see it as valuable. I remember running a focus group at one stage with a whole lot of women who were very active around things like breastfeeding and childcare and so on. And we were talking about going for paid jobs. And I said, do you ever put down your activities within the breastfeeding world? Because they were all highly experienced, competent women. Oh, no, they said, we can't put that in our CVs because we didn't get paid for it. And yet there was a whole range of skills that these women had, which would have got them jobs, but they didn't mention it. So from now on, I think from then on they did. But it really brought home to me the way we had divides now between males and females. And basically, if you look back on it, we haven't moved all that far over the last 20, 30, 40 years. Yes, we've got more women into top positions. We're even about to get possibly a new president in Italy who's known to have some fascistic tendencies, but she's a woman and the first woman they've ever had there. So what we didn't do as feminists, and I carry some of the guilt for this too, is we did not define what equality meant. And it ended up with us not shifting the values for money, power, and the various other things that men had dominated for years. And we've seen the social contract more or less disappear. Even Albo is not being very good about things like welfare payments and so on. So, I mean, this idea that there's an obligation of not customers, of citizens, oops, I nearly splintered it there, not, to do the right things for the place that they're citizens of, the country, where whatever it happens to be. And that means that the democratically elected government, which is not trusted at the moment, there's massive amounts of non-trust of government in various places, including here, that we actually, that this doesn't matter, because what we need to do is just bribe women by giving them a bit of extra pay and leaving the gender pay gap, ignoring the fact that all the care jobs which are done by women are the things that are essential and people are walking out of that. So I think we need a universal basic income as part of the strategy of getting away from the idea that we live in an economy, get back to the idea that we live in a society. Economics can be part of it, but only part of it. And we need to get back to the idea that the government has an obligation to take care of our basic needs. And I think the basic income should be there for those things that we do unpaid, not for the things that we do paid. And it should cover those essential needs that we have so that we don't have to go to the market for things that we can't afford. And we should generously give us time for, artistic, all sorts of other things, saving the environment, doing all of those things are part of our obligations as citizens. I'm not saying we don't get paid for some of it, but we will contribute to that in things. In that case, we get away from the idea that work is only there because it's paid for, and it's only valuable because it's paid for. I actually saw something recently which suggested some of those areas that women were going to into the areas that men were dominating. If you got enough women into it, the actual pay rates would drop. So we can't even get higher pay there. But I want higher pay for childcare workers. I want higher pay. It's a highly skilled thing. I remember once seeing an award in Victoria which paid more to men in parking stations than women in childcare centres. And I assure you that parking cars is a lot easier than learning with children. So I think we need to set up the idea that we have a social contract which puts those issues that women got left with in the Industrial Revolution when we got shunted off to sort of do the unpaid work and gradually brought back into things to do the low paid work. We need to get over that, cancel that, give ourselves enough money for the basics that we need, and then allow people to make the choices for okay paid things over and above those. Because obviously, if you've got you need full-time workers in a whole lot of areas, but I just want the women to get the pay and the men have to be tipped out of some of the offices where they spend forever talking about what we should be doing, And I think we need to get into those offices and say what they should be doing. How am I going for time, incidentally? I'm trying to...
You're going well, Eva, and I'm just nodding along really enthusiastically. You've got about a minute and a half, 2 minutes.
Right, so I want to say that with the future of women has to be the validation of the unpaid work, the care, the social connections, and all of those things that we count on at least equal to men, but I think we should give them a lesser allowance for things like making war and carrying on about boring economics. I think we've got to get back to the fact that human beings are social beings. We interact, we're interdependent. We have ethics, we have morals, or some of us do anyhow, and we have ways and means of living in a truly civil society. So it's time to actually put everything into the packet of not just having a universal basic income, but having a universal basic income, good social programs, and the various things that take care of us and label those as female, and a lot of the other stuff which has been buggering up the environment, and a whole lot of things about our daily lives and ruining relationships between people, etc., 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 that these are devalued, and we get back to valuing what matters, which is creating a good society which is fair to all of us and not based on men running the things that they want to run at great expense and making an unholy mess of society in the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Eva. If you could see us and hear us, I would say that there's a big round of applause for you right now. But thank you very much for that contribution. I think, it's really important to set these things in their broader historical context, not only in terms of thinking back to the Industrial Revolution, but, in terms of pre-settler colonial history in Australia and caring for people and caring for society and what that looks like. So thank you so much. I'm also thinking about putting breastfeeding on my CV, incidentally, as well. So thank you very much, Eva. Eva, if I could invite you to mute yourself now if you haven't done so already. Our next speaker, through a pre-recorded video, which I'm about to play, is Judith Willis from LaTrobe University. And I'm going to cue that video up now and play that. And then, as I said before, we also have Judith online to answer any questions after as well. And we'll do those at the end of the session. As anyone who's logged on is watching this video, can I invite you to please write any questions that you might have for either Eva, for Judith, and for Annabel, our last speaker, in the Q&A section of Meet You, and then we can address those at the end of the session. Thanks so much. I'll hit play on this video now from Judith Willis.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name's Judith Willis, and I'm a social policy researcher from Melbourne in Australia. The title of my presentation is Basic Income Improves the Lives of All People and Particularly Benefits Women and Children. Now, Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, wrote in his foreword of the UN's The Sustainable Development Goals Report 2022 that women have been disproportionately affected by the socio-economic fallout of the pandemic, struggling with lost jobs, increased burdens of unpaid care work, and an intensifying silent epidemic of domestic violence. To recover from the COVID-19 pandemic and deliver global sustainability, we need an urgent rescue effort for the UN's Sustainable Development Goals. Creating a global economy that works for all will require bold action. Now, there are 17 goals of the United Nations 2030 Agenda, 193 member states of the United Nations, and Australia is a member. Now, I've mentioned basic income, but what do we mean by that term? Well, the Basic Income Earth Network, BN, is a global organisation that provides a link between individuals and groups interested in the concept of basic income. So how does BN define basic income? Well, according to this organisation, there are 5 characteristics of basic income. First of all, it is periodic. It's paid at regular intervals, for example, every month, not as a one-off grant. Secondly, it's a cash payment. It is paid in an appropriate medium of exchange. The people who receive it can decide what they spend it on. It is not provided as food or services or in vouchers. Thirdly, it is individual. It's paid on an individual basis and not, for instance, to households. It is universal. It is paid to all without a means test. And lastly, it is unconditional. It is paid without a requirement to work or to demonstrate a willingness to work. There is one word which I query within BN's list of characteristics of a basic income, or the definition, I suppose, we're referring to. That is the word work, which is found within the fifth characteristic, unconditional, that it be paid without a requirement to work or to demonstrate willingness to work. The word work here appears to mean employment. As such, it makes invisible the value of unpaid work, such as parenting, caring, the creative arts, volunteering, and household management. Globally, women undertake a disproportionate share of unpaid work, both in developing and developed nations. That fact is ignored when the word work is only used to mean employment. As Luke's, in his book, Power, A Radical View, so aptly states, power is at its most effective when least observable. So I call upon all of you at this Congress to become more conscious of the power of language and to ban the use of the word work when it appears to mean only employment. Instead, I suggest we specifically use the term employment when we mean paid work. Otherwise, refer to paid work and unpaid work. Marilyn Waring, the author of Still Counting 2018, provides valuable insights into the implications of the non-measurement and invisibility of unpaid work. Now, the people who more often engage in activities that represent unpaid work are in effect, and that's women, of course, are in effect paid for those activities when there is a regular provision of a basic income payment, for instance, once a month by a government to each individual from birth to death. In the space of this 15-minute presentation, it is not possible to review ways in which basic income could provide bold action in relation to all the 17 of the 2030 Agenda goals. It is possible, however, to focus on how basic income could provide bold action in relation to just one 2030 Agenda goal. And I have chosen the first one, titled End Poverty in All Its Forms Everywhere. Now, in regard to the term work, meaning employment, it is noteworthy that for many decades, even a full-time job in Australia did not prevent one from experiencing poverty. Similarly, a part-time job frequently failed to protect one from poverty. Now, an ACOS, University of New South Wales, Sydney Poverty Report of 2020 stated, among people in households where the main income is wages, 7% are in poverty. This 7% is made up of families with children, or those reliant on only part-time earnings, and those with high housing costs. Since most people live in wage-earning households, this group is a substantial part, 38%, of all people in poverty. Well, if we look at poverty data in Australia more generally, women comprise a disproportionate number of persons in poverty in Australia. A policy of basic income could reduce or eliminate poverty for women in many demographic and labour market categories. Basic income would also solve the problem of children in poverty, for each child would receive an individual cash payment of basic income. The following data regarding poverty in Australia, based on ABS statistics, are available from that same poverty report I have just mentioned. In the latest year for which data are available, 2016, Australia had the 16th highest poverty rate of 36 OECD countries. Females were disproportionately in poverty. An estimated 3,820,000 people were in poverty in January 2021 after the coronavirus supplement was reduced. And more than 1 in 8 adults and more than 1 in 6 children are living in poverty. Well, I'm now going to look at, in more detail, some groups of women who would benefit most from the implementation of a policy called basic income. First of all, there are the victims of domestic violence, and the Secretary General of the UN referred to that unfortunate fact. Secondly, sole parents. In general, 8 out of 10 parents, particularly in the past, have been sole parents. People with a discontinuous paid work pattern due to pregnancy or birth of a child obviously predominantly women. Persons who undertake a disproportionate amount of the unpaid work of parenting and household management are women. Informal unpaid carers are predominantly women. Retirees with a small superannuation balance are predominantly women, as are volunteers and as are casual part-time employees. There are 2 categories of women who are casual part-time employees in the labour market that would benefit from the provision of this policy. One of them is called the Victorian Government's Sick Pay Guarantee. Now, casual part-time employees are often paid a loading of extra money, can be up to 20%, to compensate for the irregularity of their pay and perhaps low pay. However, in many cases, the actual time leave entitlements are valued as much, if not more, than the money. So the Victorian State Government is currently trialling a 2-year pilot program of paid sick leave or carers leave for persons in this category. With a basic income, however, there would be no need for a pilot program. There would be no eligibility for a limited period of time. The income of a casual contract or self-employed worker would be ongoing for as long as the sick leave or carers leave were needed. The second category of casual part-time employees who would benefit from a basic income are those from the Shards Award, instigated recently and updated by the Fair Work Commission. A central fact of this updated award for social, community, home care and disability services industries is the fact that there would now, from now on, be a care shift for a minimum of 2 hours. Now, there is some flexibility allowed, but there are reports that the arrangement, which might suit the workers because they now have a more continuous supply of income, but the arrangement does not suit clients who require multiple tasks for a shorter time frame than 2 hours. A basic income would solve this problem. There'd be no need for an award to be updated, and there would be no complexity about whether a worker could attend for less than 2 hours or not. A care worker would have continuity of income, whatever the time period of the shift, and the care recipient could request assistance for less than 2 hours if they wished. In all of these circumstances, basic income would provide a constant, secure and adequate income without having to prove eligibility for social security payments with or without mutual obligation arrangement. Women would have the financial independence to walk away from an abusive spouse or boss, particularly since the children would also have an income in their own right. Now, we've mentioned the fact that children are unfortunately in poverty also in Australia. According to the BN definition of basic income, this payment must be paid on an individual basis and not, for instance, to a household. This means that a child is entitled to receive a basic income in his or her own right. Now, more than 1 in 6 children are living in poverty, according to the ACOS UNSW report, poverty report. It is suggested here that children should receive a basic income payment equal to the value of a basic income received by an adult. In conclusion, Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, has brought to our attention the fact that women, more than men, have been affected by the socio-economic fallout of the pandemic, with the loss of jobs, an increased burden of unpaid care work, and an epidemic of domestic violence. The progress towards achievement of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, has been going backwards. To solve this problem, we need bold action. I have suggested that this bold action could be the introduction of a policy called basic income. It would solve the problem of poverty for women and children. From birth to death, citizens would receive a regular cash payment, irrespective of employment, marital status, age, or disability. No longer would jobs be critical for our survival. So basic income improves the lives of all people and particularly benefits women and children. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith, for sharing that pre-recording with us. Some really fantastic and pertinent points in that video as well. So thank you so much. And I think, you mentioned there, and we'll have some time after to discuss during the Q&A, but, the COVID-19 supplement in Australia and in many other parts of the world proved again that poverty is a political choice. And so, you spoke very well to that. So thank you very much, Judith. I would like to now introduce our third and final speaker for the day, Annabel Dulhunty from the Australian National University, whose slides will hopefully be coming up, and hopefully you can see those. And Annabel's presentation is entitled Gender Equality and UBI, a Review of Recent Literature. Annabel, when you're ready, if you could flick off or flick on your microphone and take us away. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Hi. Well, thank you so much for having me for this brief presentation. So my name is Annabel Dulhunty, and I'm at the ANU. And I first just wanted to pay my respects to the community of the Darawal land. And pay my respect to elders past and present, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. I just wanted to explain that for myself, I have been working on looking at a trial of a cash payment in West Bengal, which it goes exclusively to women. And has recently only started. It goes, it's a higher payment for women who are from scheduled castes or scheduled tribe backgrounds, and then, a lower payment for other women. So I'm not going to be talking about that today, but just, if you're interested to chat further, that's, what I've been working on. And I guess, where I'm coming at with this presentation is essentially the idea that, in many discussions on basic income, gender is sometimes, it's seen as an add-on kind of discussion, and it's not something that is seen as, core to the very intrinsic nature of whether, a universal basic income is good or not. And so I'm just, pulling this quote out here to really exemplify why we need to think about gender when we do think about all the different UBI proposals. So this is from Ingrid Robbins, and she says, most international academic discussions on basic income are gender blind. The key writers in this area do not really understand what gender is, that most differences between men and women are culturally specific and in part the legacy of a sexist and patriarchal history, which continues into the present. Now, obviously, there are numerous advocates of basic income, such as we've just heard from, who very much look at the gendered aspects of this. But what I'm arguing for is that all proposals for UBI look at the gender dimensions. So there's, I'm not going to go through all, each study in detail, but there has been, a flurry of work in the last, 5 years looking at the different pros and cons from a gender perspective of UBI. And so, if you're interested, feel free to contact me and I can share this list and summary with you. Generally, however, the feminist arguments for a UBI look, and this is what we've just heard from as well from the speakers, but they basically comes down to a number of points. One is that social security systems have very much been set up in a patriarchal manner. They reflect this valorization of work, paid work, as seen as the system that everyone should be part of, and that's very much a heteropatriarchal structure with a sort of a breadwinner in the household. And also, there's the idea that the welfare system currently disciplines women, depending, it's different in different countries. Obviously in Australia, and we've heard from other speakers, there's issues of the mutual obligations, but there's different ways that welfare systems discipline women in different countries. And feminist proponents argue that a UBI is really important because it centers care. And this is, drawing on Nancy Fraser's classic work, where she argues against this universal breadwinner model where, women's empowerment is based on the idea that we get more women into employment. And, she argues that rather than looking at getting more women into employment, we should be looking at the general life cycle approach to both men and women's lives, and acknowledge the fact that we are not just machines who merely go to paid employment. We also have numerous caring responsibilities. So feminists arguing for a UBI argue that this is really essential, that that we need to value this care, and we can do that through providing payments for carers, for example, and also incentivizing men to undertake more care. And then, a core part of this argument that cuts across many different, in many different feminist studies is the idea that, work or paid work, employment, is not just it's not some liberation for everyone. It is also defined by class, by race. And while it might be, a source of joy entering employment for some, for others, it's merely exploitation. When we look at the feminist arguments against a universal basic income, we see that, again, the same sort of topics are looked at in terms of care and labour market, but from a different approach. So, some will argue that it can entrench women into the domestic sphere because it makes it more sort of enticing for women to be at home. And, these feminists argue that we've spent a long time trying to sort of liberate women from the household. So why are we sort of trying to put them back in? Others argue that, men could use the additional income as a source of control, and that it doesn't address the root causes of patriarchy. Also that, some state that work in a labour market, has done more to address gender inequality than any potential UBI might have in that. So what I guess I want to, say here is that in many of these different arguments, it's very important to look at what type of UBI, what model is being proposed. And first of all is to look through the theoretical framework, and obviously whether it comes from a neoliberal perspective or a more a socialist perspective or a liberal perspective, and to interrogate that. But then, and this quote here from Peter Sloman talks about the fact that in the UK, many advocates are from, a neoliberal perspective. So it's looking at the overarching framework as to why people are advocating for a UBI. And then it's also looking at the details of each proposal, because every proposal is different, and the nuances can mean big things for gender equality. So I think it's interesting to look through some of the different trials that have been undertaken, and this is something that I think I'm quite passionate about seeing as well, is whether there can be more of a gender analysis in each of the different trials that have taken place. And so from the literature, there's been a bit written about perhaps some of these examples in India and Namibia, Canada, even though that's in the 1970s, and mainly purporting fairly positive impacts, mainly around sort of, women's access to healthcare and nutrition. Less is probably said about, sort of women's labour force participation rates. I think when we're looking at UBI from a gendered perspective, it's essential that we don't walk back from human rights. While some people might be, worse off with a UBI, for example, those that are, very wealthy, for example, we want to make sure that those people, that they're, at least we are not impinging on people's basic human rights. So, looking at, for example, the different conventions, and particularly ILO conventions and social protection laws that we've already committed to, I think we want to make sure that we are not stepping back from any of those. So what I argue is that rather than saying, that feminists, should be critical of UBI, I argue instead that feminists should advocate that each UBI model carefully looks at the gender dimensions and what that means for individual women and for women at different stages of the life cycle as well. So, and I think underpinning that, of course, is this idea that we need to look at the costings of each model and, essentially ask, well, what's being reduced and what's being maintained. So also then we need to consider, how does a UBI proposal, what does that mean for the poverty line? What does that mean, for example, for women in poverty who are elderly? What does that mean for funding for the basic services? Is there, necessarily a payment for children, with the understanding that women are often responsible for children, and different UBI proposals, some have payments for children, some don't? And what does that mean for maternity and other life cycle payments? So looking at Robinson's criticisms, I think rather than saying, okay, let's do away with the UBI, I think it's just important instead to consider the different gender dimensions and to ask these questions when we are looking at different proposals. So, for example, what will that mean for women's bargaining power in the household? And this is the recognition that households, are power structures in and of themselves, that they, there's a whole range of power dynamics depending on age, depending on gender. And what will that mean for women? How will that affect their relationships at home? And then also looking at what it means for women's labour force participation rate, in recognition that while employment may not be ideal for some, for many it is something that women do value highly. And what this means about care work and the distribution of labour in the household. So I would ask then that when we look at any UBI proposals, we consider whether the analysis is gender blind or gender sensitive, and whether there is discussion about the gendered impacts of that proposal, thinking about the different winners and losers and what that means for women, particularly at different stages of the life cycle. And as I said, I think thinking through the fact that a household should not be treated as one unit, it's very good, of course, that the BN proposal looks at individual payments, not household payments. And we also need to see that when we are studying it and analysing it, we are looking at the level of impact on individuals, not just the household. And then thinking through specifically, of course, what state services are funded, but also looking specifically whether what this means for the funding of childcare in nation states where childcare is funded and elderly care, given that this is, so much impacts on women's lives. And then I think also going to the heart of this is thinking through, is it assumed that that by having a UBI that gender changes are going to happen? And is it assumed that men will just automatically take up more roles of care? And I don't think that's necessarily the case. I think that there needs to be policy levers to try to ensure that men do take up more positions of care and that it's not just left to women. And then also thinking through the fact that, of course, in any funding, there are things that are often taken off the table. And what does this mean for services for women, such as, those that are preventing and responding to violence against women? So I think this is another core question. So in summary, I think that, certain UBI proposals have enormous potential. Obviously, I think the neoliberal models are misaligned and they don't do much for women. I think we need to look at the detail of each proposal and look at what is included, what is lost, and ensure that each proposal has, gender-sensitive analysis and disaggregated data. So thank you very much for that. And feel free to email me or message me if you have any further questions after this chat.
Thank you so much, Annabel. I might just flick us back onto video and just say, thank you so much, Annabel, for that fantastic presentation. Really appreciate it. I've been taking notes furiously and so really enjoyed that and really have enjoyed all three presentations. So thank you very much to our three speakers. I will open the floor up now to our Q&A. We've got about 12 minutes left in the session. So we do actually have one question that has been submitted online already. If I can encourage other online participants to submit their questions in the Q&A. If you do have any questions, please do that. But I'll move to our first online question first by Tim. Thank you, Tim, for your question. And Tim's just referring back to Judith's presentation. So Judith, I'll line you up to answer this question if you don't mind. About Victoria's, as in the state of Victoria's, sick and carers leave, would it be paid at the usual employment rate? UBI wouldn't match that, would it? Tim is asking. So Judith, would you mind unmuting yourself and responding to Tim's question if you are able to do that?
You can talk.
Tim, that's an interesting question. I don't think that it's a 2-year pilot program, by the way. I don't think it is overly generous. For instance, it's only for a maximum of 38 hours in a year, and it's only up to a maximum of $770 in a year. Whereas with a basic income, there would be much more freedom for people to use what leave they needed and still have economic support. It would, and there'd be no problems of eligibility, which apparently there are with this pilot program. There's no need to deal with bureaucracies, no need for doctor's certificates and so forth. So I know you've said that the leave would be paid at the usual employment rate. Well, that rate is quite often low for casual part-time employees anyway in service industries, particularly the aged care industry. So I think, depending upon, of course, the level of basic income, I think basic income would more than match it in many non-monetary ways as well as monetary ways. I don't know whether I've managed to convince you of that.
Thanks so much, Judith, for responding to that. So Tim, let us know if Judith has convinced you or otherwise you might have a follow-up question. Thank you very much. Can I encourage anyone else to put their questions into the Q&A box in Meet You if you do have any questions, and we can address those. But while I'm waiting for other questions to come in, I might just open up my own question, which is predominantly, I suppose, targeted at our last speaker, Annabel. And I just, I couldn't agree more that all proposals for a UBI should adopt a gendered lens. I really agree with that. I wondered if you might be able to speak to us a little bit about the possibility of broadening that to a more intersectional lens. So thinking about not just gender, but also how that intersects with other aspects or characteristics of social identity like class, race, ability, and much more. Annabel, can I invite you to speak to that if you don't mind?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that's an excellent question, and I certainly would advocate for that as well, looking at that intersectional analysis. I mean, it's more just the case that my background is in gender work, so I don't feel as much confidence in talking about some of the other areas. But certainly I think that we definitely need to look at that, particularly in the element of race, I would say. In so many cases, it is the fact that different racial groups are disadvantaged in different societies. Obviously, we live in this settler colonialism context, and in many countries there is huge issues of racial inequality. So I think I think that's a great point, that we do need to look at UBI proposals and their impact on all different types of disadvantage.
Thank you, Annabel. Can I invite, we don't have any more questions coming through in the submitted question box at the moment. Can I invite Eva, Judith, do you have any reflections on that as well in terms of an intersectional perspective?
I'm sorry, not too sure what you're referring to.
Sorry, Judith. I was just saying, obviously a gendered lens is incredibly important in terms of considering the potential or the possibility for UBI proposals. And I was wondering if you have any thoughts and feedback around, the potential importance of an intersectional lens that considers, on top of gender, other dimensions of social identity such as race, class, and more.
They are important, but if you don't mind, I'd like to pick up on the gender aspect of it, because last year in a presentation to the BN conference, I raised the idea, I think this is an idea that Eva would like, that we reciprocate in return for the security and generosity of a basic income, we reciprocate with some degree of unpaid labour. But I think, yes, I think the gender lens for all research is so important, and it's so often lacking. I was trying to find out admittedly I didn't do as thorough research as possibly I should have, but I was trying to find out the numbers of females and males, particularly adults, well, would have been adults anyway, who received a social security payment, a Centrelink payment. And I found some extensive data, but there was absolutely no gender breakdown. And I was shocked. It was the same thing with the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. I tried to get information on a breakdown of males and females for various home care package and other aged care types of programs. And it was quite difficult to obtain that information with a gender breakdown. So the gender breakdown is very important, but the United Nations of Economic Commission of Europe reminds us in their wonderful report that it is important to look at the other aspects also, the intersections with gender.
I come in.
Your question.
To you now. Thank you.
Come in.
Please go ahead, Eva.
I know mine was rather muddly and a bit of all over the place because trying to sort of put it in the timeline. But I think what's really important, and one of the things that underruns mine, is the fact that this is about the social. It's not necessarily about just rescuing victims. I think that's one of the problems we've had as feminists, that we do a lot of rescuing of victims and very little structural and value changes. And I think it's important to take a look at the fact that a very large proportion of what is done in the world is done by women under discrimination of a particular type, which does go across a lot of different nationalities, cultures, and various other things. One of the problems I've found in the bits and pieces that I have managed to gain from the conference is we're pleading and asking and trying to prove with statistics that the people that are actually winning and have been for the last 2,000 odd years are going to continue winning because they're not going to present anything on it. I think we need to get back to the idea which I was trying to put up in the first place, that if we're going to survive as democracies, if we're going to survive as decent places, we must actually get back to the idea that the social is more important than the bloody market crap that sort of is going on at the moment in terms of survival. The democracy will only survive if we trust governments. And one of the reasons we can't trust governments is that they are so tangled up with this economic rubbish, which is all about monetizing everything. And I just think that the women's stuff really focus on monetization, on the fact that, we only count those things that are given a monetary thing and raise it in relation to women. The other stuff will fall into line. But women are the biggest group and the most exploited group. And we need to put it together as a plea for a future that we can manage when we have all of the crises that we're having at the moment and various other things, because care and relationships and ethics and all of the sort of good things about being human beings and, and connecting with others and offering help to others and being part of a society are the things that are going to allow us to survive for the next 20 years. And if we keep sort of adding in a little bit of this and a little bit of that and a little bit of others, we fall away from the main argument, which is slightly more than half of the inhabitants of the world have both their livelihoods and their skills so totally undervalued that we're likely to go back to something which is far more primitive and nasty than what we've got now. So I think let's stick with gender. I'm really concerned about the other groups, but that will follow, because with gender we might be able to put fairness and a good society back on the agenda at the moment by uniting on that particular issue, rather than just asking nicely or unnicely for them to sort of be nice to us and give us a bit more money.
Thank you, Eva, for those comments. We do have one more question. We've got another minute to go, so I might just, we might end after this question, but we do have a question from Tony Hassan, which is a question from Tony at the Equality Rights Alliance to Annabel. So given your reading and research, Annabel, what model seems to have the most benefits in terms of women and children, and what policy levers should complement it to ensure gender norms change?
Hi there. I've only got a very short time, so I won't say too much, but feel free to email me if you want to chat further. I think it's important just to start with I'm not an advocate for one particular model. I think it's a matter of scrutinising each model. And I think first starting with what's being taken out and ensuring that things such as childcare, elderly care, and maternity leave are not taken out of proposals. So I think that's the first place to start. And secondly, I think thinking through the policy levers, it is around also influencing change. And so, incentivising care work for fathers, for example, such as they've done in Germany and some other Scandinavian countries, I think is an interesting way that perhaps could be incorporated into it. And also just looking at the funding, to see how it's going to be funded and if it's going to tax women too highly who are in employment. So looking at other models, perhaps through funding from different windfall taxes or billionaire taxes, but that may not, of course, meet the same level of payment thresholds as, models that look more highly at taxation. But I think it's really going into the nitty gritty of each proposal. But happy to tease that out further in a different chat.
Thanks so much, Annabel. So maybe that's an email to Annabel, Tony, to follow up on those nitty-gritty details as well. We are right on 4:30. I've just been, I received a text saying I might have missed some questions in the discussion chat, and I really apologise for that. I can't see the discussion chat on my screen at the moment, so I do apologise to anyone's questions we couldn't get to. But I would just like to finish by thanking from the bottom of my heart our speakers, Eva Cox, Judith Willis and Annabel Dulhunty. Thank you so much for taking the time to share your research and your thinking with us this afternoon. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
You.